I thought she was just the woman who cleaned my penthouse, until she pulled an illegal weapon from her apron and told me I was about to be framed for a felony. I had two choices: trust the maid who was sent to monitor my every move, or face a cage for the rest of my life for crimes I didn't even know were being committed in my name. I never thought my life would come down to a charade performed in a penthouse overlooking the city. My name is Julian, and for the last 5 years, I have been drowning in a sea of corporate litigation, hostile takeovers, and a reputation that was being systematically dismantled by people who wanted my seat at the head of the table. To them, I was a target. To survive, I needed an anchor, a veneer of stability, family values, and normalcy that a bachelor like me lacked. That's when I turned to Elena. Elena had been my housekeeper for 3 years. She was quiet, efficient, and possessed an unsettlingly sharp intellect. She saw everything: the confidential documents I left on the mahogany desk, the late-night stress-induced pacing, the way my hands shook when I realized my accounts were being drained. She never asked questions, and she never spoke unless spoken to. She was the perfect ghost in my machine. One Tuesday, after a particularly brutal board meeting where I'd been threatened with an investigation into my private dealings, I decided to make the pitch. "Elena," I said, catching her as she polished the silver in the dining room. She stopped, her head bowed in that practiced, submissive tilt she always adopted. "I need a favor. A massive, life-altering favor." She looked up, and for the first time, I noticed her eyes weren't just brown. They were the color of cold, polished flint. "I am paid to clean your home, Mr. Sterling. I am not paid to participate in your affairs." "I'm willing to change that," I countered, leaning against the doorframe. "I need a wife. A fake one. Just for the next 6 months. My shareholders are worried about my stability, and there's a merger coming up. If I appear to be a man with a steady home life, the board will stop breathing down my neck. You play the role, attend the galas, smile for the cameras, and keep my life looking picturesque. In exchange, I'll provide you with enough money to disappear, to start a life wherever you want." A complete, clean slate. She didn't blink. She didn't stutter. She walked over to the table, placed the polishing cloth down with agonizing precision, and stared at me. "You think your enemies are limited to the board of directors, Julian? You think they're just suits trying to steal your shares?" I paused. "What do you mean?" "You're playing with fire," she whispered, her voice losing its soft, service industry tremor. "You think you're being hunted by corporate rivals, but there's an organized scheme operating right under your nose. They've been using your shell companies to move their forbidden cargo, and they've been waiting for you to get desperate enough to seek protection. That's why you're being framed for that grievous accusation, the attempt to break your life with a felony charge." My blood went cold. The documents I'd been seeing, the ones I thought were just accounting errors, flashed through my mind. I had been looking at shipping logs that didn't make sense. I had been looking at invoices for maintenance that were far too expensive to be real. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. "How do you know that?" "Because," she said, finally stepping into my personal space, "I didn't get this job through an agency, Julian. I was sent here to monitor you. And until now, I thought you were the one pulling the strings." The room seemed to shrink. The silence was absolute, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city traffic miles below. I realized then that the woman I had thought was a simple maid was holding the keys to my salvation, or my destruction. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small encrypted drive, placing it on the table between us. "If we are to be married, Julian," she said, her voice chillingly calm, "we need to be on the same page. Because if we aren't, the people watching this house are going to realize that I've stopped reporting back to them. And when they realize that, they aren't going to send lawyers. They're going to send a team to make sure you never reach the courthouse." She tapped the drive. This contains proof of the illicit goods they've been pushing through your ports. Open it, and your life as you know it ends today. Leave it closed, and you'll be in a holding cell by sunrise, facing decades in a cage for crimes you didn't even know were being committed in your name. I looked at the drive, then up at her. She wasn't just a maid. She wasn't even just a spy. As the lights in the penthouse flickered, a sudden, sharp thud echoed from the front door. Someone was testing the lock. Someone was inside the building. Elena didn't reach for her phone. She reached into the waistband of her skirt and pulled out a concealed, illegal weapon, the cold steel gleaming under the chandelier. Choose, Julian. Now. The sound of the lock clicking open was like a gunshot in the sterile silence of the penthouse. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt like a death knell. I looked at the weapon in Elena's hand, a compact, illegal piece of hardware that looked entirely too familiar in her grip. Her posture had shifted completely. The domestic, submissive maid was gone, replaced by someone who held herself with the coiled, lethal tension of a predator. "Get behind the island," she commanded, her voice devoid of its earlier warmth. It wasn't a request. It was a tactical directive. I scrambled behind the reinforced marble, my mind reeling. The accusations, the corporate sabotage, the phantom board members, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying truth. I wasn't just a CEO fighting for his company. I was the front for an organized scheme that had been bleeding my reputation dry to cover their tracks. The grievous accusation they were planning to pin on me was a way to keep me quiet while they burned my legacy to the ground. Footsteps echoed in the foyer, heavy, rhythmic, and professional. These weren't thieves. They were the cleanup crew. "They know," Elena whispered, her eyes fixed on the hallway. "I was supposed to signal them 3 hours ago. When I didn't, they assumed I had been compromised. Or worse, that I had flipped." "Who are they?" I hissed, peering over the edge of the marble. "The board? The chairman?" Elena let out a dry, mirthless laugh. "The board is just a puppet show for the public, Julian. The people coming through that door are the ones who actually own your ports, your warehouses, and your soul. They are the ones who put the packages with the substances into your supply chains, and they don't leave witnesses." The footsteps stopped. A voice, smooth and chillingly polite, drifted through the dark entryway. "Elena, we know you're in there. The internal audit on your loyalty came back negative quite some time ago. Why don't you come out? We have no interest in the man. He's just a liability that needs to be settled." My blood turned to ice. They were offering to let me live, provided I stayed in the dark. But I knew better. They wouldn't let a man who had seen the inside of their books walk away. Elena looked at me, her expression unreadable. She tossed the encrypted drive onto the floor near my feet. "If you want to live, you plug that into your private server and hit the broadcast button. It will upload the files to every major media outlet and the Internal Integrity Bureau. It's an insurance policy. If we die, the data hits the cloud. If we survive, we have the leverage to burn them all." "And if I do that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They'll know it was me." "They already know, Julian," she whispered, raising the weapon toward the foyer. "The question is whether you want to die as a patsy for their organized scheme, or as the man who brought them down." Before I could answer, the front door swung open. A shadow moved with terrifying speed, a flash of motion that shattered the tranquility of my home. Elena fired, the sound of the suppressed weapon a dull thwip that didn't wake the neighbors, but certainly hit its target. A heavy thud followed. "Go!" she shouted. "I can hold the foyer, but there's a second team coming up the service elevator." I grabbed the drive and scrambled toward my office. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the unit. I reached my workstation and jammed it into the port, my fingers flying across the keys. The screen glowed, illuminating my face in a pale, ghostly light. Uploading. 12%. 15%. Suddenly, the power in the penthouse cut out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. My computer screen died instantly. I was trapped in the pitch black, the only light coming from the faint, blinking red dot on the drive. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound right behind me. Not from the hallway, but from the window that overlooked the balcony. I realized too late that I hadn't just left the front door vulnerable. A cold, heavy hand clamped over my mouth from behind, and a whisper, hot and sharp, brushed against my ear. "The upload won't help you now, Julian. You're going to tell us where the hard keys to the offshore accounts are, or your fake wife dies in the next 5 seconds." He turned me around, and in the moonlight, I saw the face of the man who had been my primary legal advisor for the last 5 years. He held a phone to his ear, and through the speaker I heard Elena's voice, strained and gasping, as if she were being held at knife point. "Julian," she croaked, "don't give them anything, don't—" The call cut off with a sickening crunch. The advisor looked at me, his smile wide and devoid of any human empathy. "Your turn." My heart plummeted into my stomach, a cold, hard stone of realization. The man holding me was Marcus, the legal genius who had spent the last 5 years protecting my assets. He was the architect of my rise and, as it turns out, the master of my downfall. He had been the one whispering into my ear about legal strategies, all while maneuvering me into a position where I was the sole legal occupant of a company used for illicit distribution. "Marcus," I managed to choke out, my voice sounding foreign even to my own ears. "You've been my right hand, and you've been the perfect skin to wear, Julian," he whispered, his grip tightening. He didn't just hold me, he controlled me, his strength surprising for a man who spent his days in silk suits. "Do you really think an organized scheme like ours survives without a fall guy? You were the perfect vessel, successful, isolated, and completely oblivious. You provided the legitimacy we needed to move our packages through the docks. Now, unfortunately, you've become a nuisance." He shoved me toward the desk, forcing me to kneel. The red light on the encrypted drive was still blinking, but the screen was dead, the power severed by a master kill switch. "The keys, Julian," Marcus commanded. "The offshore access codes. We know you kept them in an encrypted file in your private vault. If you give them to us now, maybe I'll let you live long enough to watch your reputation burn in the courts. If you refuse, I'll finish what we started in the hallway with your wife." I felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate, irrational courage. I thought of Elena, the way she looked when she held the weapon, the cold, calculated look in her eyes that told me she wasn't just a victim. She was part of something bigger, and she had sacrificed everything to get this far. If I gave in, she died for nothing. "You're too late," I rasped, leaning back against the mahogany desk. "I didn't trust you, Marcus. I never trusted anyone." Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "I moved the keys," I lied, my voice steadying. "I knew the board, or whoever you work for, was watching. I sent the credentials to a dead man switch. If I'm not online to verify my heartbeat every 24 hours, the data dumps directly to the Internal Integrity Bureau. And by the way, I haven't been online for almost 30 minutes. Marcus's eyes widened. For a split second, the mask of professional control slipped, revealing the frantic greed underneath. He shoved me aside and lunged for the computer, trying to bypass the hardware lock. That was my chance. I didn't think, I moved. I grabbed the heavy marble paperweight from the desk, a relic from my father's office, and swung it with every ounce of frustration and fear I possessed. It connected with the side of Marcus's head with a sickening crunch. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, sliding to the floor in a heap. I scrambled up, gasping for air, and rushed toward the door. I didn't care about the money, the company, or the penthouse. I had to find Eleanor. I sprinted into the hallway, my chest heaving, the sound of my own footsteps echoing against the marble like gunfire. I reached the foyer and my breath hitched. The front door was swinging wide open, letting in the cool, rain-slicked air of the city night. There was no sign of Eleanor, but there was a trail of blood leading toward the service elevator. I followed it, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone, only to realize it was gone, likely shattered in the struggle. I moved to the elevator, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm. The elevator was at the lobby floor, motionless. Suddenly, the lobby lights flickered. A voice crackled through the intercom, distorted and static-filled. "Julian," a voice rasped. It wasn't Marcus. It was deeper, colder. Someone who sounded like they were speaking from the bottom of a well. "You've caused enough trouble for one night. You're playing a game you don't understand. If you want to see Elena alive, come down to the basement parking structure. Come alone, and leave the drive behind." The intercom cut out, leaving me in the oppressive silence of the hallway. I looked at the encrypted drive in my hand, the only thing that could save me, or ensure my demise. I heard the hum of the elevator moving upward, not toward my floor, but toward the roof. I realized then that the lobby wasn't the target, the roof was. And as I turned, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a helicopter engine beginning to spin up on the landing pad above me. They were leaving, and they were taking Elena with them. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward the fire escape stairs, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I burst out onto the roof just as the helicopter began to lift, its spotlights cutting through the rain. There, kneeling near the edge of the helipad, was Elena, her hands bound behind her back. Standing over her was a tall, imposing figure, his face obscured by the blowing wind and the glare of the lights. As the chopper lifted further, he turned toward me, and in his hand, he held not a gun, but a small, detonator-like device. He spoke, his voice carried over the roar of the rotors. "You had a choice, Julian. You chose poorly. Now, watch as everything you built turns to ash." He pressed the button, and the floor beneath my feet began to rumble. I realized, too late, that this wasn't just a kidnapping. The building wasn't being targeted by a group, it was being rigged to collapse. The roar of the helicopter rotors was deafening, a chaotic mechanical scream that drowned out my own desperate shouts. The building shuddered, a deep, structural groan that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. It wasn't just a threat. They had seeded the support columns with explosives, turning my own fortress into a ticking bomb designed to bury the evidence, and me, under tons of concrete and steel. "Elena!" I screamed, lunging toward the edge of the helipad. The tall figure on the chopper simply watched, his features masked by the shadow of the cockpit, his thumb resting casually on the detonator. Elena lifted her head. Her face was bruised, a cut tracking down her temple, but her eyes were still burning with that same cold, relentless resolve. She didn't look at me with fear. She looked at me with a silent, urgent warning. She shook her head, gesturing toward the ledge behind me. I turned. A secondary team clad in tactical gear was swarming the rooftop access door, their weapons drawn. They weren't there to kidnap me. They were the cleanup crew, sent to ensure that if the building didn't do the job, their bullets would. I dove behind a ventilation unit just as a hail of gunfire shredded the metal. Sparks showered down on me, the smell of ozone and burnt paint filling the air. My mind raced, clawing for a tactical advantage, but I was cornered on a rooftop in the middle of a thunderstorm, with the building beneath me already beginning to list. "Think, Julian, think." I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the encrypted drive. If I went down, the drive went down. If I survived, I had to be the one to broadcast the truth. But how do you stop a collapse from the roof? Then I remembered the server room. It wasn't just my office. It was connected to the building's automated structural monitoring system. designed to shut down the elevators and lock down the perimeter in case of a breach. If I could tap into the building's local network from the rooftop maintenance terminal, I might be able to trigger the emergency override, not to save the building, but to trap the people inside the basement, and, more importantly, to force an automated digital broadcast of the drive's contents through the building's high-speed satellite uplink. I scrambled toward the maintenance panel, bullets pinging off the steel around me. I ripped the cover off, my hands slick with rain and sweat. I jammed the drive into the interface. The screen flashed. Access denied. "Damn it," I roared. "Julian!" A voice pierced through the cacophony. It was Elena. She had managed to break her zip ties using the serrated edge of a nearby railing. She was moving with fluid, lethal grace, diving toward the tactical team. She didn't have her weapon, but she had the element of surprise. She slammed into the nearest operative, grabbing his weapon and firing a quick, controlled burst. She wasn't trying to win the fight. She was creating a gap. "The override code," she shouted over the rotor noise, her voice strained. "It's your mother's birthday, you idiot, the one you put on everything." My breath hitched. I punched in the numbers. *0412. The screen turned green. System override engaged. Broadcast inity ship. Broadcast shut belate. Below us, I heard a series of heavy, muffled thumps. The blast doors to the lower level slammed shut, trapping the tactical team on the roof with no way down. The helicopter overhead paused, the pilot clearly confused as the building security system turned against them, locking their landing gear onto the rooftop restraints. "Get to the chopper!" Elena yelled, sprinting toward me. We reached the helipad, the wind whipping our clothes, the building groaning beneath us like a wounded beast. The man with the detonator turned, his composure shattered, and leveled a weapon at us. But he was too slow. Elena vaulted over the railing, tackling him into the pilot's cabin. The helicopter lurched, its rotors clipping the building's antenna. I grabbed the doorframe just as the chopper began to spin. Below, the city lights were a blurred smear of gold and white. I stared down at the streets, realizing with a sick sense of horror that the demolition charges were already detonating on the lower levels. The building was beginning to implode in a controlled, terrifying cascade of concrete. The chopper stabilized for a heartbeat. I saw Elena struggling with the pilot, the controls spinning wildly. "Julian, jump!" she screamed. "It's going to hit the building!" I looked at the drop, 50 stories of death. I looked at the helicopter, tilting precariously toward the collapsing roof. I didn't have a choice. I leaped into the void, the cold air rushing past my ears. I felt a hand grab my jacket, a grip like iron. It was Elena, dangling from the side of the chopper, her eyes locked onto mine. But as she pulled, the helicopter's engine gave a high-pitched, metallic shriek. A plume of black smoke erupted from the exhaust. We were losing lift, and the building below was no longer a structure. It was a crater opening up, a gaping maw waiting to swallow us whole. As we plummeted, I saw a flash of light on the horizon. My phone, which I had discarded in the office, had been linked to the broadcast. On a giant digital billboard 3 blocks away, my face appeared, along with the encrypted files that Marcus and his cohorts had tried so hard to bury. The truth was out. The whole city was watching. But as the helicopter tilted, the main rotor caught the edge of a crane, and we were sent into a violent, spinning descent toward the darkness of the city docks. Elena's grip on my jacket started to slip. The fabric was tearing. "Hold on," I shouted, reaching for her wrist. She looked at me, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "The broadcast is live, Julian. The world knows. Now we just have to survive the landing." The ground rushed up to meet us, a collision that felt inevitable, final, and terrifying. Just as we hit the water of the harbor, something metallic clicked against my neck. A tracking device, planted by the person I least expected, and it began to beep with a rhythm that wasn't just for location, but for something far deadlier. It wasn't a tracker, it was a timer, and it had 5 seconds left. The cold, black water of the harbor was an instant shock, a brutal contrast to the searing heat of the plummeting helicopter. I didn't think. I acted on primal instinct. The moment we hit the surface, the cabin crumpled like aluminum foil. The beeping at my neck, a high-pitched, rhythmic torture, seemed to harmonize with the sound of the rising tide rushing into the mangled wreckage. I clawed at the collar of my jacket, my fingers numb and fumbling. With one frantic motion, I ripped the transmitter off, throwing it as far as I could into the dark expanse of the water. A second later, a dull, muffled thud shook the bay, sending a plume of bubbles and debris to the surface. It was a close-quarters explosion, intended to seal our fate beneath the silt and salt. I grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her through the shattered window frame of the cockpit. She was sluggish, her breath hitching as she struggled against the pressure, but she followed my lead. We kicked our way toward the surface, the moonlight dancing in broken shards above us. When my head finally broke the surface, I inhaled a lungful of freezing, salty air that tasted like victory. We dragged ourselves onto a rusted, barnacle-encrusted pylon beneath the main shipping pier. We were battered, bleeding, and utterly exhausted. But we were alive. In the distance, I could see the chaos. The building I had called home, my empire of glass and hubris, was a smoldering ruin, a skeletal tomb for the organized scheme that had tried to consume me. "Is it done?" Elena whispered, her head resting against the cold iron of the pylon. I looked up at the cityscape. Every major news feed, every digital display, every smartphone within 5 miles was lit up with the files from that drive. The truth had leaked out faster than the water from the harbor. I saw the flash of emergency sirens converging on the site, not just police, but the Internal Integrity Bureau agents, the ones who had been tracking the scheme from the shadows all along. "It's done," I replied, my voice raspy. "The accounts are frozen. Marcus and the others are trapped in the debris of their own ambition. The truth is out there, and there's no way to put that genie back in the bottle." Elena finally looked at me, her eyes clear of the tactical fog. She reached out, her hand finding mine. Her grip wasn't the iron-willed command of a soldier anymore. It was the touch of someone who had survived the impossible. "I was never supposed to get close to you, Julian," she admitted, her voice soft against the sound of the lapping waves. "My directive was to ensure the files were retrieved or destroyed. I was supposed to let you fall." "Why didn't you?" I asked. She sighed, a sound of weary relief. "Because you were the only one who didn't treat me like a piece of furniture. You were a mess, and you were arrogant, but you were human. And after 3 years in that house, I realized I'd rather die trying to save a human than survive by serving a monster." In the distance, a boat approached, a sleek, unmarked vessel. It wasn't the police. It was the extraction team I had hoped for, the only people I'd been able to send a signal to before the power went out. My own private contingency, a group of legal and security experts I'd quietly funded for years, just in case the corporate rivals ever turned out to be more than just suits. As the boat pulled alongside our pylon, I stood up, helping Elena to her feet. The transition from the penthouse to this ruined dock felt like a lifetime. I had lost the company, the penthouse, and the life I had spent a decade building. But as I looked at Elena, I realized I had shed the cage that had been built for me. The months that followed were a blur of depositions, courtroom testimonies, and the systematic dismantling of the organized network. Marcus was dragged from the rubble, alive but broken, and he sang like a bird to save himself from the decades of incarceration that awaited him. The grievous accusation against me was dropped, dismissed as a blatant frame-up orchestrated by the very people who had tried to silence me. I never went back to the corporate world. I didn't want the seat at the head of the table anymore. I had learned that the higher you sit, the more you have to lose, and the more likely you are to become a target for someone else's greed. Elena and I settled in a small coastal town far from the skyscrapers and the glass offices. We didn't need the money we had liberated from the offshore accounts. We donated it to the victims of the scheme's long-standing, quiet exploitation. We lived simply. I found that I quite liked the silence of a house where no one was watching, and where the only things I had to worry about were the tides and the occasional storm. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I pulled a small silver item from my pocket, a spare key to a house that was no longer a prison, but a home. I held it out to her. "No more fake marriages," I said, a smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. "No more spies, no more tactical maneuvers, and definitely no more cleaning service." Elena looked at the key, then at me. She took it, her smile mirroring my own. "I think I can live with that, Julian. But don't think for a second that I've forgotten how to handle myself." "I wouldn't dream of it," I laughed. We had been through the fire, the ice, and the deepest waters of corruption, and we had come out on the other side. The story of the fake husband and his housekeeper had become a cautionary tale for the city, a legend whispered in the boardrooms of the powerful. But for us, it was just the beginning of a life that was finally, truly, our own. The past was a memory, the danger was a shadow, and as the stars came out over the harbor, I knew I had finally stopped playing a part. I was exactly where I was meant to be.